The Punjab Lalit Kala Akademi, Chandigarh brings to its galleries a unique exhibition titled The Printed Picture, 4 Centuries of Indian Printmaking. Curated by Dr. Paula Sengupta, an eminent artist, the collection comes from the Delhi Art Gallery's repertoire and brings us closer to the years of Indian printmaking in Chandigarh at our gallery. Welcome to Punjab Lalit Kala Akademi. So Paula, we talked a lot about the exhibition that you have curated here as part of the DAG Modern's print making exhibition, but we would like to know you more as an artist, because you are multifaceted, bringing a lot of dimensions of your personality and art. You teach and you are a printmaker, you do installations, performance, and of course also design and costumes is something that you're very interested in. And feminine issues, feminine, urban feminine values and come a lot into your work. So tell us a little about your repertoire of work and how do you, create such a diverse repertoire as a person and as a teacher as well, because academics is something that's very close to your heart.
It's difficult, to say the least. I, wear far too many hats, I think, sometimes. So I am a full-time academic. I teach in the Department of Printmaking at the Rabindra Bharati University in Calcutta. And but printmaking is very, very close to my heart, and therefore I enjoy teaching it. And one has to be constantly innovative to ensure the life and survival of the medium, because printmaking is perhaps one of the most threatened mediums of art.
Okay.
So I try to do my bit for it by teaching, curating, writing around it, and so on. In terms of my own practice, there are many things that have gone into shaping it.
Right.
I studied painting at the College of Art in Delhi as a bachelor student.
Okay.
And I had printmaking as a subsidiary subject.
Okay.
But I had a wonderful teacher in Anupam Sood, who is inaugurating the exhibition here today. Yes, she was my teacher.
Okay.
And so it was actually thanks to her that I developed this interest in printmaking, and I took so much to the medium. Maybe I was temperamentally suited to it, but also I was deeply drawn to her as a practitioner, as a person, as a teacher. And it was she who suggested to me that I do a master's in printmaking,
Okay.
which I went on to do at Shantiniketan, and where I had wonderful teachers. Again, in Shaunat Kaur and others, my guide, Dr. Nirmalendu Das, under whom I did my PhD afterwards. So, and Shantiniketan was wonderful because it was, it's a very intense environment. It's an idyllic environment.
Yes.
You live with your work. There's a lot of flexibility. But also over there, I learned that that there are no valid, hard and fast mediums of making art.
Okay.
Whatever the artist makes valid as a medium for making art is valid. So Nandalal Bose had this wonderful holistic approach to making art, and there were a lot of what were earlier seen as the lesser arts or as crafts, so to speak, that he imbibed into the languages of art making.
Right.
So there I learned to work equally in mediums like drawing, painting, and of course printmaking, in which I specialized, but also in textile, in embroidery, in weaving, in ceramics, in all mediums like this that I loved from my childhood. I learned to embroider and stitch from my nani and my grandmother and my mother, who were great seamstresses themselves. And so it constitutes part of my inheritance, and
Yes.
I always did it from my childhood.
Okay.
I did it right up to my Shantiniketan years. But then I actually drifted away from it because, I'm talking about the early 90s.
Okay.
When art making was very confined to painting, sculpture, printmaking. There were very rigid boundaries, unlike now when,
Yes, the
almost
world
anything is
has
valid.
opened.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, so for a time I was, only a printmaker, and I was sort of working at all of this. And I did a lot of printmaking, I did a lot of residencies in printmaking. I went into, but I was never entirely happy with the print on the wall format.
Okay.
I wanted to go beyond that.
Right.
So my first step beyond that was in bookmaking.
Okay.
I was in a residency in California, and it was a wonderful printmaking studio, a huge place with every kind of printmaking facility, including very cutting edge technology. At the time, digital printmaking and so on was just coming in.
Right.
And now they have very advanced studios in moving image and so on, all under that same roof. So you could do everything from very old school letterpress printmaking, letterpress printing, to
Digital.
Digital under that one roof.
Okay.
So it was fascinating, and it opened up a whole world for me. I was never I'm not a person who's very comfortable with, with computers and digital technology and everything. I'm more a making kind of person. Which is not to say I don't entirely use these, but they are not, I would not generate an entire work digitally. I don't feel comfortable with that, because I need to physically communicate with my
feel
making.
yes.
That's important for me.
Yes.
So, but in California, this place was called the Kala Art Institute. I learned to use the letterpress, and I started making books, and with etching and letterpress and so on, and that opened up a whole wonderful world for me, because I was also I also love to write.
Okay.
And often, words and images actually occur simultaneously for me.
Okay.
So this was an aesthetically wonderful way for me to incorporate text and image. And I started to do this, and I've made a lot of books in my lifetime, since 1997, 98, when I went to Kala, up to now. I've made a lot of.
And these comprise your works and your
Yes,
texts?
and when I say books, I should actually use the word narratives, because they
Right.
don't follow necessarily the codex format.
Okay.
So my books are sometimes large enough to fill up this room, and sometimes they're small enough to hold in the palm of your hand.
Okay.
So I should say narratives rather than books.
Right.
And but that was my first step outside the print on the wall format. And I came back, and I continued to practice. I had by this time set up a printmaking studio of my own. I'd bought a press and
In
all
Calcutta?
that. In Calcutta, yes. I have an etching press. And in 1999, I started teaching as guest faculty at the National Institute of Fashion Technology in Calcutta.
Okay.
That actually marks a major shift in my interests and my practice.
What year was this, Paula?
1999.
19.
And it has actually a great impact on the way in which my practice developed.
Okay.
So, I was teaching here, I was taken on to teach art appreciation, which was sort of art history based. But I was teaching to design students,
Right.
fashion design students, so naturally I had to orient myself a little differently. But I went on to teach history of costume.
Okay.
And you know, textiles, costume, fashion, these were things that I was very interested in from my childhood,
Right.
but I had not looked at them in any formal way.
Okay.
And nor had I ever looked at them seriously as languages and art making.
Right.
But now, because I was teaching, I was, you know, I had to look at it more seriously. And sometimes I think that if there were institutions like NIFT in, you know, when I was a student, maybe I would have studied fashion and not art. So, or textile or something, because I love textile,
Right.
you know, that's sort of my other great passion. So, so that is the time that I actually, you know, so history of costume opened up a whole new world for me, because everything that I had learnt in art history, I was looking at from a different perspective. I was trying to, you know, teach costume, fashion, the body, you know,
Performance,
how,
yes.
You know, costume can act, or just garment, fashion can actually transform the body,
Right.
accord it a different identity, a different personality entirely.
Right.
And this was fascinating for me. And you know, the history of textile and costume and how it is so interlinked with, you know, with sort of politics, with anthropology,
Yes.
with social history, even economics.
I agree with you.
So, I was, you know, really taken with all of this. And it was years when I sort of, you know, the 5 years that I spent at NIFT, I grew tremendously along with my students.
Right.
Because NIFT was a new institution in Calcutta, it was growing, it was finding its feet. There were the first batches of students, we worked together. That's the time that I went into installation and performance work, because now I was becoming increasingly interested in the body, as I said to you,
Right.
and you know, the body as a three-dimensional object. I was interested in how the body behaved in space, how it transformed space. I became interested in space and sites themselves and activating them.
Okay. The architectural sites as
Yes.
well. Yes.
And so, you know, just because I was looking at the body, I became interested in all of this, and my work started to make three-dimensional demands.
Okay.
You know, I mean, work makes its own demands.
Right.
And my approach to it has always been that I shift mediums according to the demands of my work, what my work asks for.
Right.
So now I started, you know, appropriating and embracing textile, printmaking, installation, performance, text, all of this in my work. And those were wonderful, very productive years that I spent at NIFT. I left NIFT, I moved from there in 2001, though I continued to teach as guest faculty at NIFT till 2003. But I moved to the Rabindra Bharati University to the Department of Printmaking in 2001. And you know, printmaking was my core practice, and NIFT was a very demanding job. It, you know, if it was just job satisfaction that I wanted, I would have continued at NIRFT.
Right.
But I also wanted time for my own practice.
Right.
And the university allows that freedom because it's part of the job description to, develop
Practice,
your own
yes.
profile. So I moved to the university. And I was back in the printmaking studio,
Okay.
and it was very enriching.
It
actually.
was?
Yes.
Okay.
I loved it.
Okay.
Because a printmaker is, once a printmaker, always a printmaker. You crave those horrible toxic substances, those acids, those smells.
Okay.
They're poisonous like hell, but you love them.
Addictive.
And, yeah. So I was happy to be back, and so, that was 2001, it's 2018 now, it's 17 years, I've been at the university, and I have done a lot of work. My practice has grown. I work across mediums,
Right.
I work across, methodologies, and I went actually very seriously into working in textiles. I find printmaking and textiles, they are like, kindred spirits in certain ways. Because on the one hand, when we print on cotton rag pulp paper usually.
Okay.
And so, the textile and the paper, rag pulp paper behave a lot like each other. I also print a lot on, rice papers, Nepali paper, papers like that, which are so akin to textile.
Right.
So akin that you can even iron these papers. So, so that plus the fact that, you're taking an impression, which is something that you do on textile all the time. Texture, which is so integral to printmaking and also to textile. Texture, surface,
Design,
the
yeah.
tactile quality, which are, that is actually the common space of printmaking and textile arts,
Okay.
the tactility.
Okay.
And the tactility, any printmaker will tell you that tactility is primarily what attracts you to the printmaking medium. And so, I started, sort of blurring these boundaries and increasingly working more and more in all of these mediums. My first, also along the way my concerns changed. You were asking about, feminist, I would call them undertones in my work.
And autobiographical as well? Some of them?
All my work is autobiographical in most cases, yes. So, what started to happen is that in 2004 I got married, and I moved to my husband's home, which is like this now 111-year-old heritage house in the heart of Calcutta. It's like this huge rambling colonial property. And the entire neighborhood, Calcutta is an old city, and the entire neighborhood around it is transforming. All the old houses are coming down and apartment buildings are coming up in its place. Ours is one of the few that's left standing. I personally come from a very, very different background. We come from East Bengal, and my family was displaced by the partition, and we came across the border as refugees, and so there is the whole history of resettlement that my family went through, and my grandparents and my parents were first generation immigrants, and they went through very difficult times, and these are the stories that we grew up with. And there was no home.
Yes.
So in 1992, my father built a house in Salt Lake in Kolkata, and that is what is home.
Right.
Home does not go beyond that for me.
Yes.
So, so when I moved to my in-laws' house, who were a very, very settled West Bengal family, it was a very different experience for me. And I started looking at the issue of heritage, inheritance, you know, heritage and inheritance as two synonymous words. I started looking at all of this. I started looking at this issue with my in-laws family as a sort of case study. And you know, they come from, I mean, that is a family of who were very involved with the Swadeshi movement, and many of the first Bengali entrepreneurs actually come from their family. So blue chip Bengali companies like Bengal Waterproof, Duckback, everybody knows about Duckback, Sen Raleigh Cycles, and Sikh Call, which was a glass and crockery company. So these were, you know, indigenous Bengali entrepreneurships that came up as a resistance to British entrepreneurship at the time. And so this was the family I married into, and I started looking at all this history very, very interestedly. And my method of working has always been to collect, you know, I just talk to regular people like you and me, and I collect stories. And then I look at these stories against larger, you know,
concerns,
mega histories that are in textbooks. Right. And but I started collecting stories from the women in the family. Okay. And they were very, very interesting because the women in this family are very enterprising. And they're kind of a law unto themselves. So I started to find their stories very interesting, and I was talking more and more to them, and I was, you know, this was my mother-in-law and her cousins, and and so with all these stories, I made a project that was on that particular property. It was called, so that property used, it's in, you know, 18th century maps of the city. It used to be a Jewish neighborhood, and then, you know, it became British and so on. And that is also the time I seriously started working with textile. Most of the time I work with found textile. And so, you know, there were all these stashes. It's an old house, and you know how things crawl out of the woodwork in old houses. So there were things stashed away in cupboards, in trunks and all that. So I pulled out this huge stash of linen, you know, crochet, lace, all sorts of things, which were from my mother-in-law's trousseau and her mother's trousseau. Wow. And she said, throw them away. So I kept them, you know, as I didn't have the heart to throw them away. I didn't know what I'd do at that point, but I kept them. And then I started embroidering. When I did this project, I started embroidering. I started constructing costumes out of all of this. Okay. And so I worked across mediums with textile, with printmaking, with glass etching, with paper making. Paper making is the other thing I do. I love it. And, you know, it again very akin to printmaking. And you know, now I also started working with photography, sound, text, video, all that. So this project developed over 2007, 8, 9.
What was it called?
It was called 8 Shots Bazaar, which was the Jewish name of the neighborhood, / 8 Short Street, which is what it's called now. Yeah. Okay. And but that led me to actually investigate my own personal inheritance and history, because it represented, you see, West Bengal has two kinds of settlers. One set who had been there forever, and one set who came in as refugees from East Bengal. Yes. And I was married into one, but I came from the other. Yes. So this led me to actually investigate my history, and I started looking very seriously at that, and you know, talking to my family members to collect their stories. In 2008, for the first time, I crossed the border to Bangladesh, and I had always wanted to go, but my parents had such bitter memories,
right.
and you know, my uncles, my aunts, they had such bitter memories that they never wanted to go. I could never persuade them. I went for a workshop, but when I went, it was extremely unsettling for me. You know, on the one hand, I felt that I belonged, but on the other hand, I was an alien.
Yeah.
And it was just a few days that I went for. I came back and I had to go again.
Oh.
I
Okay.
felt compelled to go again. So, in 2008, I went back. For a longer stretch, I went for a residency, and I traveled the length and breadth of Bangladesh. Part of the time, my mother traveled with me. It was a completely different experience traveling with her, because you know, she had real memories of
Right.
the place. And we found my father's family home, we found my mother's family home, and it was, while it was very enriching, but it was also a very, very traumatic experience. And I kept a diary through those travels. And I also started looking very, very seriously in Bangladesh. I discovered what is called the Naqshi Katha.
Okay.
So the Katha is a quilt.
Hanji.
It's the quilting technique.
Okay, so it's not the embroidery, like we say Kantha embroidery.
No, so Katha is originally the making of the quilt.
Okay.
It's made from old tech fabrics, like old saris and
Right,
so
right.
on. And you quilt this with a run stitch.
Okay.
It's made by the women in the house. And so I had always known the Katha, but I'd never looked at it seriously. But when I went to Bangladesh, I discovered what they call the Naqshi Katha. So the Naqshi Katha is this, you know, so you can have a simple Katha, which is just the
Hanji.
quilting of the fabric with the run stitch.
ठीक है.
And the Naqshi Katha is full with patterns, narratives, all of that, you know. So I discovered the Naqshi Katha. And I realized that the Naqshi Katha was actually a narrative field, that it was a picture making language.
Okay.
And it was a feminine practice.
Right.
So I will say that I am, you know, that my work is feminist in the sense that I lay claim to practices that are traditionally seen as women's practices, as women's languages. I lay claim to those as valid art making mediums.
Right.
You know, my mother or my grandmother, they were expert seamstresses. My grandmother came from a place called Khulna, which is famous for its Naqshi Kathas.
Okay.
She could make beautiful Naqshi Kathas, which, you know, a Naqshi Katha is usable on both sides.
Okay.
She could make these. My mother learned to make it from her. I learned to make it from them. And my mother used to say many times, you know, when she would see me work, she used to say many times that I could also have been an artist. And she did want to go to art college.
Okay.
But in those days, you know, women
Yes.
from respectable families didn't go to art college, and my grandmother wouldn't hear of it. But it was actually true,
Absolutely.
you know. And so I will say that I am feminist in the sense that I laid claim to these practices and to the women's voices that had not been taken seriously
Yes.
for so many
Yes.
centuries. And because when I look at those Naqshi Kathas, you know, they are the anxieties, the concerns, the lives of the women who made them.
Completely.
All of that is played out in that exquisite narrative field that constitutes the Katha.
Yes.
So I started, so I actually laid claim to that to make work now. And I saw that as part of my inheritance, my legacy.
Yes.
So in that sense, I took it.
Yes.
And so I started making this body of work about 2 years after I came back from Bangladesh. The basis of that body of work was the diary that I had kept.
Okay. Okay.
And it took about 2 years for that whole experience to settle. And then the work started coming out. So then that was the first time I started using embroidery, katha, applique, and making very specific choices in textiles. I was taking textiles like the Dhakai muslin, which is so linked with the politics of colonization because, because they didn't want the know-how to, the colonizers didn't want it to survive. They chopped off the thumbs of the muslin weavers. Jamdani, which is so specific to Bangladesh. And so textiles like that and the katha embroidery with it. So both medium, making, material, all of this actually became signifiers.
Absolutely.
In the way that I was
and memory
working.
And history and narratives.
Yes.
Wow. So this is
So
like
all of this. So I made the first project in this was it was called Rivers of Blood.
Okay.
And the second project, so this Rivers of Blood was about the partition. But in investigating the partition, I kept hitting upon the 1971 Bangladesh War of Liberation and the birth of a new nation, because that's where Bangladesh actually starts, their historical narrative begins. And I kept coming up to that. And also because my father was in the army and, he was part of the Bangladesh War and many of his contemporaries were also in the war, I started increasingly, hitting upon this, and it kind of, these narratives kept coming back to me. And so I did the second chapter, which was Love Pony, which talks more about the...
Love Pony.
It's called Love Pony, yes, because one of the people I spoke, I got a lot of stories from was, he retired as a brigadier from the army, but he was in the war and he's nicknamed Pony, and he would sign off his communications to me saying Love Pony. So that's why it was called Love Pony. And so that was the second chapter, and it talks about those who get left behind by the war, the anxieties that are generated by the war, the women, the children, all
and
of
using
that.
These various
mediums.
narratives.
Yes. I wanted to do a third sequel where I wanted to actually add the, the Pakistani voice.
Okay.
I had a residency to go to Pakistan, but I never got a visa.
Okay.
So that remains in abeyance. I became, as a result of this, very interested in stories of migration and something that I identified with, loss of home, migration, enforced migration. What the loss of the motherland, the loss of language, what all of this means, the mother tongue, what all of this means. My husband is a trekker in the Himalayas, and I move with him occasionally.
Okay.
So, I'd been traveling for over a decade in the Himalayas with him to various places and places that are contiguous with Tibet.
Okay.
I've never been in Tibet, but in Ladakh, Spiti,
all of
Zanskar, Sikkim, all sorts of places in Nepal, Bhutan, so that whole terrain that is contiguous with Tibet. And I'd been looking at a lot of Tibetan communities in exile. My husband is a photographer, and so he wanted to make a trip to Dharamshala to document the Tibetan community in exile. So I went along with him. And in Dharamshala, for the first time, it actually hit me. And I'm a collector of objects. So all this time that I had been traveling, I had been collecting, you know, Tibetan textiles, puppets, paintings, tankas, dolls, all sorts of things, costumes of various kinds. Until I went to Dharamshala and I realized, it hit me for the first time, that there is this entire country in exile functioning out of a hilltop in India.
So true.
And it really hit me hard. And I started collecting stories from people in exile. And trust me, those are incredible stories. And it is so sad because it is a hopeless situation, but the hope is alive in their hearts. It was something I identified with because, you know, because of my own family history and the fact that I can never have my home back.
True.
So now, since what is it now? 18, I don't know, maybe the last 4 or 5 years, I've been preoccupied with Tibet. And I have an ongoing project called Into Exile, which has been growing. It's been exhibited in parts, but it has a life of its own.
Right,
it grows.
Like this exhibition.
Yeah, it grows, it carries on. And again, you know, it is very, very close to my heart.
I hope we can see it
yeah,
sometime.
I feel very strongly about that. But it's politically sensitive.
Yes.
As Tibet is.
Yes.
So it's not easy to show. I'm happy to show it if anyone else is happy to show it.
I'm sure the Academy would love to show it.
So that's where I stand currently in terms of my practice.
Great, Paula.
Yes.
It was absolutely wonderful to know you and your concerns and your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.